a poor woman is forced to marry a stranger after being kicked out of her house by her parents. She just didn't know he was a millionaire. Emily Carter had always known that her presence in the Carter household was more of a tolerated inconvenience than a welcomed addition. At 23 years old, she had spent most of her adult life walking on eggshells around her parents, who seemed to grow increasingly resentful of her with each passing day. Living in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of Rome, Georgia, the Carters were not wealthy people. Her father, Martin Carter, worked long hours as a mechanic, and her mother, Linda, cleaned houses to help make ends meet. Neither of them had ever gone to college, and they resented the fact that Emily had dropped out after only 1 year, citing anxiety and lack of direction as her reasons. What hurt the most wasn't the disapproval. It was the coldness. Conversations had long ago turned into commands, and their home was more a shared space of silence than a place of support. Emily had tried. She picked up odd jobs: cashier at a gas station, waitress at a diner, babysitter for a neighbor's kids. But the jobs were unstable, often part-time, and never enough to contribute significantly to the bills. Her mother accused her of being lazy. Her father, more blunt, called her useless. The last straw came on a grey Monday morning. Emily had returned home after a failed job interview in Atlanta, her last shot at something steady. She entered the house soaking wet, from the rain, carrying her worn leather handbag and the weight of another rejection. Her mother stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed with disappointment before Emily could even open her mouth. "What now?" Linda snapped. "Another excuse? Another dead end?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't have the strength. Her silence enraged her father, who stormed in from the garage. "That's it," he growled. "You're not a child anymore. We're not your safety net. If you can't pull your weight, you can't stay." She stared at them, heart pounding. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," her father said. "You have until this evening to pack and get out." Her mother didn't object. She didn't even look away. And just like that, Emily's entire world crumbled. With shaking hands, she packed what little she had into a single suitcase. A few changes of clothes, a pair of shoes, a small photo album, and a notebook filled with her scribbles and poems. By the time the sun had started to set, she stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known, soaked once again by a light drizzle, shivering and stunned. She had no money, no friends close enough to call for help, and no plan. Her phone battery was dying, and she didn't even have a car. Her parents hadn't said a word as she left. No hug, no goodbye. Just the soft click of the door closing behind her. She sat on the curb for what felt like hours, unsure of where to go. It wasn't until the porch light of the house next door flickered on that she noticed the silhouette of Mrs. Halloran, the elderly widow who lived alone. Mrs. Halloran had always been kind in passing, a soft hello, a smile over the fence. Now she watched Emily with a concerned frown. "You all right, dear?" she called out, her voice thin but warm. Emily couldn't speak at first. She just nodded slowly, tears beginning to fall. Mrs. Halloran came closer, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You come inside now. Can't let you sit out in the rain like that." That night, Emily slept on the guest couch in the old woman's house under a worn quilt and with the comforting hum of a heater beside her. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't pry. She just made a cup of tea, handed Emily a towel, and told her she was welcome for a few days until she figured something out. The next morning, over a modest breakfast of toast and jam, Mrs. Halloran spoke again. "I have a friend in Atlanta, Clara. She runs a little restaurant. I think might be able to help you. I can call her." Emily, her heart still raw from the previous day, nodded gratefully. She had nothing left in Rome. Atlanta, with all its unknowns, was better than the ache of staying where she wasn't wanted. By noon, her few belongings were repacked, and Mrs. Halloran had arranged for a neighbor to drive her to the city. She hugged the old woman tightly, whispering a quiet thank you she hoped conveyed all the gratitude words couldn't carry. As the car pulled away from the only street she'd ever called home, Emily stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. She didn't know what waited for her in Atlanta, but she knew one thing. Her life was no longer tied to the people who had never truly accepted her. Whatever was coming, it was hers to face alone. Atlanta was nothing like Rome, Georgia. The buildings were taller, the people moved faster, and everything seemed to buzz with a sense of purpose that Emily had never known. The car ride had been quiet. Her driver, a retired man named Roy, didn't ask questions, and she was too overwhelmed to offer any explanations. When they arrived, he dropped her off in front of a narrow brick building with a faded sign that read Clara's Kitchen. The place looked modest but clean, homey in a way that made her feel for the first time in days a small sense of safety. Clara herself was a woman in her early 60s, with tightly coiled grey hair, bright brown eyes, and a commanding presence. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. After a quick glance at Emily's tired face and small suitcase, Clara led her inside, set her down at a table and handed her a glass of water. "You're Linda Halloran's girl from next door," she said matter-of-factly. "She said you needed a place. I don't do charity, but I do believe in helping people who help themselves. I've got dishes to wash and floors to mop. You game?" Emily nodded without hesitation. That's how the next 3 days went. Emily worked in the back, scrubbing pots, sweeping, slicing vegetables, and occasionally running food to the tables when someone didn't show up for their shift. She didn't complain, she barely spoke. But every day, Clara gave her a meal, a little cash, and let her sleep in the tiny break room on a cot with a thin mattress and a scratchy blanket. It wasn't comfort, it was survival. But to Emily, it was also a strange sort of grace. By the 4th day, her hands were red and sore from constant work, but her eyes had regained some clarity. She started to pay attention to the regular customers, learning names and routines. Among them was a tall man with sharp features, thick dark hair and a quiet demeanor. He came in at the same time every afternoon around 2 o'clock and always sat at the corner booth away from the windows. His order never changed: black coffee, no sugar, and a plain turkey sandwich on rye. Clara called him Mr. Hale. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't sociable either. He read newspapers, actual printed ones. He never looked at his phone. Occasionally, he would make polite comments about the food or the weather, but never more. Emily served him once, careful not to disturb him, and he simply nodded in thanks. There was something about him, controlled, calm, and unreadable. On her 5th day, the shift ended early. A storm was coming, and Clara decided to close up shop by late afternoon. As Emily was mopping the floor near the back door, Clara walked over and spoke in a lower tone than usual. "Mr. Hale asked about you today," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Wants to speak with you, said he has a proposal." Emily stopped mopping. "What kind of proposal?" Clara shrugged. "Didn't say. Just told me to send you out when you were done." Curious and slightly uneasy, Emily stepped outside where Mr. Hale was standing under the awning, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the street as rain began to fall in thin sheets. He looked over as she approached, giving a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Emily, right?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. You've had a rough week. Clara told me some of it." Emily didn't respond. She wasn't sure how to answer that without crumbling again. He continued, "I'm going to ask you something that might sound strange. I need you to keep an open mind." She said nothing, waiting. "I need to get married." The words hung in the air like a misfired bullet. "I beg your pardon?" she said, genuinely unsure if she'd misheard. He looked directly at her, his tone even. "Married, legally. It's a personal matter, but it needs to happen soon, and it needs to be with someone who isn't going to complicate things." "I don't understand." Her voice was small. "I'm offering you a contract, a legal marriage. No romance, no expectations. You'll live in a property I provide. I'll cover your expenses, and in return, you'll be my wife on paper for 1 year. After that, we can part ways quietly. You'll be compensated fairly. $50,000. Emily stared at him, her mind racing. "Why me?" "Because you have no ties, no history in Atlanta, and no reason to exploit this. And Clara says you're trustworthy." "That's not an answer." He seemed to weigh his next words. "There are legal and business reasons. Some connected. To inheritance, others to privacy. I can't go into all the details. What I can promise is this: I'm not dangerous. You'll be safe, you'll be independent, and I'll respect your space." Her instinct screamed that this was mad. Who offers marriage to a stranger? Who accepts? And yet here she was, jobless, homeless, and clinging to the edges of other people's kindness. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then nothing changes," he replied. "You continue working here. You try to get on your feet some other way. I walk away, no pressure." She looked at his face, searching for any sign of deceit, any crack in his stoic exterior. But there was nothing, just a man offering something that didn't make sense on paper, but made a strange kind of sense in her heart. "I need to think," she said. "Of course, but not too long. Time matters." That night, she lay on the cot in the back room of Clara's kitchen, staring at the ceiling while the storm howled outside. Her mind ran through every scenario. Was this a trap? Was he running from something? But more than fear, she felt something else, a jarring calmness, as if her life had already tipped so far off course that nothing could surprise her anymore. She had no safety net, no family, no real options, and $50,000 could mean more than freedom. It could mean a future. By morning, her decision was made. When she walked into the diner the next day, Mr. Hale was already there. This time, she sat across from him instead of standing. "I'll do it," she said. He only nodded. "Tomorrow," he replied. "Be ready by 10 o'clock in the morning." The morning air was crisp, cutting through the thin fabric of Emily's borrowed dress like shards of glass. Clara had given her something simple but elegant to wear, a pale blue shift that reached just below the knees, and a dark wool coat to cover her trembling arms. She hadn't owned anything formal in years. There was no makeup, no jewelry, no ceremony. Just a silent ride across the city in Nathan Hale's sleek black sedan. He didn't speak much during the drive. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his fingers resting loosely on the steering wheel. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't warm either. It felt like everything about the moment was suspended in air, waiting to settle, but never quite doing so. They arrived at a small legal office on the outskirts of Atlanta. Nothing flashy, just a modest two-story building tucked between a pharmacy and a bank. Inside, everything was precise, efficient, clinical. The paperwork was already prepared. Nathan had a lawyer present, a quiet man named Richard, who spoke only when necessary and asked Emily to sign in several places. There was no exchange of vows, no rings, and no witnesses beyond the legal staff. Just a few strokes of a pen, a handshake, and then it was done. She was now Mrs. Emily Hale. Nathan led her back to the car without ceremony. As they drove, he finally spoke, his voice clear and controlled. "You'll be staying in a house I own outside the city. It's quiet, not too far from here. You'll have your own space, your own bedroom. I won't interfere with your daily routine as long as you respect mine." Emily nodded slowly, processing the clinical nature of what had just happened. "And the contract?" He glanced at her briefly, before returning his focus to the road. "It's binding for 1 year. After that, we go our separate ways. You'll receive your compensation in full, no questions asked." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," he said, "we coexist. No public appearances, no need to pretend in front of anyone. Just follow the few rules I'll give you." When they arrived, the house was not what Emily expected. It was a single-story structure nestled at the edge of a wooded area, with a gravel driveway and an old but well-maintained front porch. Inside, the furniture was sparse but tasteful, minimalistic in a way that suggested either intentional design or a lack of interest in decoration. There were no photos on the walls, no personal touches, just clean lines and quiet corners. Nathan gave her a quick tour. "This is your room," he said, opening a door at the far end of the hallway. "Mine is across from it. Kitchen's stocked. I'll be gone most days. You're free to come and go, but don't bring anyone here, that's important." Emily stepped into her room and took in the space. It was modest, a full-sized bed, a dresser, a desk by the window. Nothing fancy, but far better than the cot at Clara's. She placed her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, the reality beginning to sink in. She was married, legally, to a man she didn't know, under conditions she barely understood. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm defined by silence and space. Nathan left early each morning and returned late in the evening. Emily heard the door open and close, the sound of shoes being removed at the entrance, the soft clink of glass as he poured himself a drink or heated a meal in the microwave. He never entered her room. He never asked questions. She spent her days cleaning, not because she was asked to, but because the stillness unnerved her. She wiped down counters that were already clean, swept floors with no dust, reorganized drawers that barely held anything. The house, much like Nathan, seemed designed to keep things hidden. At night, she sometimes heard him pacing in the living room, murmuring to himself or talking softly on the phone. She never eavesdropped, partly out of respect, partly out of fear. There was something about him that felt tightly wound, as if any disruption could cause a shift neither of them was prepared to handle. One evening, as she was putting away a stack of folded laundry, she noticed something odd. A framed document, tucked between a row of books in the living room shelf. She wasn't snooping, just placing a throw pillow on the couch when the edge of the frame caught her attention. She slid it out carefully and read it. It was a business license. Hale Innovations. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a name she recognized, but the document bore seals and signatures and looked legitimate. She made a mental note, but didn't dare ask him about it. Later that night, while sipping tea at the kitchen table, she finally spoke. "Do you ever miss having someone to talk to?" Nathan stood by the fridge, holding a glass of water. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her as if the question itself was foreign. "No," he said finally. "Not really." She smiled weakly. "That makes one of us." He didn't smile back. But he didn't walk away either. In the weeks that followed, their routine remained unchanged. They passed each other like ghosts, occasionally sharing short conversations about groceries or mail, but nothing deeper. He left early, came back late. She cooked occasionally, unsure if he'd eat it. Sometimes he did. Other times he simply said, "Thanks," and returned to his office, a room she hadn't been inside since arriving. What struck Emily most was the loneliness, not just hers, but his too. It clung to him like a second skin, even though he did everything to hide it. He moved through the house with precision, always composed, always distant. But there were moments, quiet, accidental ones, where she caught glimpses of something else, a photo album half hidden under the coffee table, filled with images of places she didn't recognize. A scar on his right hand, shaped like a burn that he always kept covered when in public. A night when he returned home soaked from the rain, and stood silently in the entryway, dripping and staring into space for a full minute before removing his coat. Emily didn't push. She didn't ask. But she wondered. And slowly, the wonder began to grow into something she couldn't quite name. Not affection. Not yet. But a curiosity that felt dangerous in its own right. Because for all his silence, Nathan Hale was a puzzle, and she was beginning to need the answers. By the start of the second month, Emily's internal clock adjusted to the strange rhythm of her new life, one that felt suspended between anonymity and performance. Each day mirrored the one before, the early rustle of Nathan's departure, the low hum of silence that filled the house in his absence, and the soft, unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence in the late evenings. The days moved slowly, but her thoughts did not. They crowded her mind like static, feeding on the quiet and growing louder with each passing hour. Despite the security Nathan had provided, a roof, food, and space, Emily couldn't shake the weight of uncertainty. She barely knew the man she had married. She knew how he took his coffee, which groceries he bought regularly, and that he rarely used his phone inside the house. But beyond that, he was a void. He offered no details about his work, his past, or even his preferences. Every interaction was polite but hollow, as if they were co-workers sharing a long shift rather than a married couple under the same roof. One rainy afternoon, Emily sat on the living room floor sorting through a stack of books from a dusty shelf. Nathan had gone out early and hadn't mentioned where he was going. A week earlier, she might not have noticed. Now, she did. She noticed everything. The way he avoided eye contact when conversations lasted more than a few sentences. the tension in his jaw whenever the topic of outside came up, and most of all, the lack of any personal presence in a space clearly lived in. She pulled out a novel, then another, until a small leather-bound journal fell between the cushions. It wasn't hidden, but it didn't look like something meant to be found either. Her fingers paused, unsure. She knew she shouldn't open it. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but the silence had begun to feel oppressive, and part of her needed some form of proof that Nathan Hale was more than a name on a marriage certificate. She opened it. The pages were blank. Every single one. But the fact that it existed at all, placed between books on philosophy and economics, unsettled her more than if it had been filled with secrets. Why keep a journal and never write in it? Was it meant to be used, or was it a prop in whatever world Nathan was trying to maintain? Later that night, when he returned home soaked and silent from the storm, Emily decided to speak. "You never told me where you go every day." He didn't answer immediately. He removed his coat and shook off the rain, his face unreadable. "I work," he said simply. "Doing what?" He glanced at her, a flicker of hesitation passing over his features. "Investments, finance, mostly remote, but some meetings in the city." It was the first time he'd offered even that much. She held on to the word mostly, wondering how much of his time was really spent at meetings. Before she could ask more, he turned and headed down the hall, ending the conversation as abruptly as he'd started it. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tumbling over each other. The way he kept everything at arm's length, the lack of warmth, even in his kindness. The sensation that everything in the house had been curated for a role he didn't want to play. The next morning, she decided to ask Clara if she knew more about him. She called from the house phone. She had no cell service in the area and spoke in a low voice. "Clara," she said, "I just need to know, what did you really know about Mr. Hale before introducing us?" Clara was quiet on the other end for a moment. "I knew he was decent," she said finally. "Private, yes, but decent. Paid on time, never rude. Seemed like someone who needed help and didn't want to ask for it directly. That's why I thought of you." "But you don't know what he does, or who he really is." "No, honey. And I didn't ask. Some people build walls for a reason." The conversation didn't comfort Emily. If anything, it confirmed that she had married a stranger whose past and present were completely concealed, and she was living in his house under a contract she barely understood, isolated from everyone she had ever known. Her growing suspicion wasn't born from paranoia. It was the accumulation of details too small to notice individually but glaring when combined. The untouched books, the unused journal, the lack of family photos, the absence of phone calls, visitors, or even mail addressed to him. And yet, despite all of that, he had moments, rare, fleeting, where a hint of vulnerability slipped through. Like the time he paused too long in the rain before entering the house, or the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, as if trying to understand something he couldn't explain. It was during one of those moments, a quiet Thursday evening, that Emily reached her limit. They were both in the kitchen. She was making tea and he stood at the sink rinsing a glass. She turned to him, her voice firm. "Why did you really marry me?" He looked at her, caught off guard. "I told you. Practical reasons." "That's not enough anymore." He put the glass down and dried his hands. His face remained calm, but his eyes, always so distant, betrayed a flicker of something else. "You needed a way out. I needed someone I could trust. That's it." "But you don't trust me," she said. He didn't answer. "You've given me everything except the truth," she continued. "This house, food, space. But you keep yourself locked behind a wall. I'm not trying to pry, Nathan. I'm trying to understand." His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might actually say something real, but then he turned away, reaching for his coat. "I have a meeting," he said. He left without another word. Emily stood there for a long time, her hands still around, the warm mug of tea, her heart pounding. For all the material comfort Nathan had provided, she realized she had never felt more emotionally abandoned. She had survived being thrown out by her parents, But nothing prepared her for being invisible inside a home that wasn't hers, next to a man who acted like a ghost. The first true obstacle wasn't poverty. It wasn't loneliness. It was living. Beside someone whose walls were so high, she wasn't sure they could ever be breached. And yet somewhere deep inside, something compelled her not to give up. Not yet. Because she hadn't just married a stranger, she had agreed to live with one. And something told her that behind all the silence, Nathan Hale had more to hide than she ever imagined. Emily had never been particularly nosy. She respected boundaries, sometimes to her own detriment, but the longer she stayed in Nathan Hale's house, the more the silence screamed. It filled the corners of every room, coated every polite exchange, and hummed between the lines of every ambiguous answer he offered. After nearly 3 months of cohabitation, Emily could predict his movements, but she still couldn't read him, and that, more than anything, gnawed at her. One cold morning in late February, the heater rattled through the vents while Emily organized a cluttered drawer in the kitchen, one she rarely touched. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to do, anything to make her feel less stagnant. Most of it was junk, old batteries, tangled cords, pens that had long since dried up. But nestled under a stack of unopened mail was a thin envelope with a bank's logo printed in bold at the corner. The seal was broken. It had clearly been opened but never discarded. She didn't mean to pry, truly. But her eyes caught the first line, bold, centered text listing a balance followed by a number so large it didn't seem real. The amount was in the high 6 figures. She froze. Her fingers hovered, heart accelerating. She glanced around instinctively even though she was alone. The silence was still intact. Only now it felt heavier. She set the envelope down, untouched again. But the image had burned into her memory. It wasn't just a savings account. It was an account showing frequent wire transfers, the kind of movement one might expect from a business, not a personal fund. And yet the account was clearly under Nathan Hale's name. The implications swirled like a storm in her head. Nathan had told her he worked in investments, finance. But this wasn't some modest income. This was wealth, considerable wealth, and it wasn't hidden, not exactly. But it wasn't volunteered either. For someone who claimed to want a quiet, uncomplicated existence, living like a middle-class recluse in the suburbs didn't line up with numbers like those. When he returned that evening, she watched him more closely than usual. He walked through the door as he always did, removed his shoes, loosened his collar, and gave her a simple nod before retreating to his office. Emily stared at the closed door, debating. She didn't confront him that night, or the next, but she started noticing other things, small details that her brain had previously dismissed. His laptop was state-of-the-art, the kind of high-performance machine used for trading or running heavy analytics. He kept a stack of business cards tucked away in his briefcase. One night, after she'd gone into the kitchen for water and passed his office door slightly ajar, she caught sight of his screen. It wasn't spreadsheets or emails. It was code, real code, the kind she recognized from her short stint in college. Nathan Hale wasn't just involved in finance. He was involved in something far more technical and likely far more significant. On the 4th day after discovering the bank envelope, Emily couldn't take the weight of it anymore. They were eating dinner in silence, each chewing methodically, as if food was simply another task to complete. Emily put her fork down, folded her hands on the table, and stared directly at him. "I saw the bank letter." Nathan didn't flinch, but he stopped mid-motion. He set his fork down slowly and met her gaze. "I didn't mean to," she continued. "It was open, I was cleaning, but I saw the balance and the transfers." He remained still, quiet. "You're not just an investor, are you?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a tone more serious than she'd ever heard from him, he replied, "No." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to admit it. "I own part of a company," he continued, "a tech firm based in New York. I started it with a partner. We developed security software for financial institutions and eventually some government applications." Emily blinked. "So I'm a co-founder. The company runs mostly without me now. I stepped away a couple of years ago for personal reasons." She leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Why hide it? Why live like this? He took a sip of water, then met her eyes again. Because money complicates everything. I've seen what it does. To people, to relationships, to trust. I didn't want a marriage built on someone knowing how much I had in the bank. I needed someone who didn't see the number first. You thought lying by omission would fix that? No, I thought it would give me time. Time to figure out if you were who you seemed to be. And maybe time for you to decide if I was someone you could tolerate without all the noise. Emily looked down, her pulse thrumming in her ears. That's not exactly fair. No, he agreed, it's not. The silence stretched between them again, but it was different now. Tense, charged. She rose slowly from the table. I think I need to go for a walk. Nathan didn't stop her. Outside, the night was cold and crisp. The stars were barely visible through the haze of city lights, and the wind stung her cheeks. Emily walked for nearly an hour, circling the quiet suburban blocks, replaying every moment of the last 3 months. The kindness, the restraint, the cold distance. Now, layered over it all, was the knowledge that Nathan Hale wasn't just reserved. He was wealthy, powerful, and hiding far more than he'd ever shown. And yet, despite the deception, she didn't feel betrayed in the way she thought she would. She felt confused by the fact that he had been honest the moment she confronted him, that he hadn't tried to excuse or deny anything, that he had looked at her not with arrogance, but with something resembling vulnerability. When she returned home, the lights were dimmed. Nathan was in the living room reading, his posture as tense as ever. Emily stood by the doorway. So what now? She asked. He looked up at her, closing the book slowly. That's up to you. She didn't move. Are there other things you haven't told me? Yes. Will you tell me eventually? I will, he said, if you want to hear them. Emily nodded once, then turned and walked to her room, but she didn't close the door. That night, for the first time since their contract began, she left the hallway light on. A signal. She didn't fully trust him. Not yet. But something had shifted, and for the first time, the silence in the house felt less like a wall and more like a door. Emily had always known she wasn't meant for luxury. Her life, stitched together from modest jobs and unspoken sacrifices, had never touched the surface of the world Nathan Hale came from, but knowing something in theory was vastly different from witnessing it with her own eyes. In the days following his partial confession, the air between them shifted. Their interactions were still cautious, but there was a thread of honesty woven into them now, a thread thin enough to snap but strong enough to hold tension. Nathan didn't volunteer more information, but he no longer shut her out entirely. Occasionally, over dinner or during their few shared moments in the kitchen, he would let slip the kind of detail he had once guarded with silence. Mentions of conferences, past business trips, cities she had only seen in movies. It wasn't much, but to Emily it was enough to know that his world extended far beyond the walls of their suburban home. She began to notice the patterns. On certain days he would dress slightly more formal, choose different colognes, check his watch more frequently. He always left early those days, with a sharper energy than usual. On one such morning, curiosity overruled caution. She waited 15 minutes after he left, then grabbed her coat and quietly followed. Nathan drove a dark, understated car, not flashy, but new. Emily took a rideshare and instructed the driver to keep distance as she trailed him through Atlanta's maze of streets. She expected an office building, perhaps something tucked inside a mid-tier business park. What she didn't expect was the towering glass structure they finally stopped in front of, with a name she recognized even from a distance: Hale Tech Systems. Her stomach twisted. Hale Tech. The name was real, and it bore his. She watched him walk through the front doors without hesitation, security guards nodding in recognition. This wasn't a side business. It was a world, a complex, high-profile empire that he had intentionally hidden behind worn sweaters and plain routines. Emily remained in the car, unable to step out, unable to breathe fully. He wasn't just wealthy. He wasn't just a former executive who had stepped away. He was still part of it, active, involved, respected. The man who made her eggs on Sundays, who walked barefoot in the house and fixed the leaky faucet without calling a plumber, was the same man whose name carried enough weight to secure a 40-story skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. She returned, home without waiting for him to exit. Her mind spun with implications. Why had he chosen to live so modestly? Why hide his name, his status, his legacy? The answer, perhaps, was the same he had already given. Money complicates everything. But the depth of the lie or omission was staggering. That night when Nathan came home, she didn't greet him. She sat on the couch, lights dimmed, waiting. He didn't pretend not to notice. He removed his coat slowly, watching her as if anticipating confrontation. "You followed me," he said, not accusatory, not surprised. "I did." Nathan didn't sit. He remained near the door, his posture unreadable. "I told you there were things I hadn't shared." "You told me you stepped away from the company." "I did. I'm not on site often. I mostly manage the strategy now." "You own it." "I co-founded it," he corrected. "But yes." Emily rose, her voice rising with her. "Do you understand how insane this is? You've had me living in this house, working like a guest, in your world, while the real you, this version that the public knows, exists 5 miles away like another person entirely. I didn't want this to be about that. But it is, it has to be." He finally walked closer, hands in his pockets. "You think I'm ashamed of it?" "I don't know what to think. You lied by omission. That's still a lie." Nathan's face shifted, a flicker of frustration escaping his carefully constructed calm. "I've spent years trying to separate myself from that life. You think it's glamorous, but you have no idea what it's like to never know who's being genuine and who's calculating their percentage. And what am I supposed to be, a moral experiment? You were someone who didn't know who I was. That mattered to me." Emily stared at him, the words hitting harder than she'd expected. "It still matters, but now I'm questioning everything." He stepped back slightly, as if retreating from the weight of her words. "I can explain more. If you want the full story, I'll give it to you. But not tonight. Not like this." She didn't respond. She turned away, walked to her room, and closed the door behind her. The next day, Nathan left early again. Emily sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring out the window, trying to piece together the image of a man she no longer recognized. And yet, something inside her refused to believe it was all manipulation. His discomfort, his avoidance, his silence, it hadn't been arrogance. It had been fear, not of exposure, but of disappointment. Still, she needed more. She needed to know who she had married and why he had chosen her. So she returned to the city, but this time she didn't follow him. She walked into Hailtech's public office, where a receptionist greeted her with practiced politeness. Emily introduced herself using her full name, Emily Hale, and the reaction was immediate. Eyes widened, posture straightened, tones shifted. "Oh, of course, right this way," the receptionist said, standing so quickly that her chair rolled back. Emily was ushered into a private lounge and offered water, coffee, snacks. No questions were asked, but the quiet reverence confirmed. To everything she feared, she was known, not just as Nathan's mysterious wife, but as someone important by association, and that kind of attention wasn't something she'd ever known how to handle. Nathan arrived 15 minutes later, having been pulled from a meeting. He entered the room looking tenser than she'd ever seen him. "I told them to call me if you ever showed up," he said quietly. "I needed to see this," Emily replied, looking around. "All of it. I needed to understand it." He didn't argue. "They respect you here. They fear you a little too." He didn't deny it. "I'm not sure I belong in this world," she added, eyes narrowing, "but I'm tired of being shut out of it." Nathan took a slow breath, his voice low and deliberate. "Then stop standing outside." Emily looked at him for a long time. "I don't know how. Let me show you." The words hung in the air, thick with weight. Neither of them moved. For the first time, they stood on equal ground, not as strangers bound by contract, but as two people finally confronting the truth of who they were. Emily walked past him toward the exit, but this time she knew he would follow. The silence in the car on the way home was unlike any other they had shared. Nathan drove with his usual quiet control, eyes focused on the road, hands steady on the wheel, but the atmosphere between them had changed. Something unspoken now filled the space where awkward small talk once resided. Emily sat beside him, staring out the window, her thoughts tangled. She had spent months living under the same roof with a man she barely knew, and in a single afternoon the veil had been lifted. The mystery wasn't gone, not completely, but for the first time she felt the possibility of something honest forming between them, even if neither of them knew what that something was. Nathan didn't speak until they were almost back to the house. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "About showing you." Emily turned her head, her voice quieter than she expected. "I know you did." He glanced at her just once, before returning his focus to the road. "I never planned for this to go beyond convenience. I told myself I needed a quiet, manageable arrangement, but it stopped being manageable the moment you started asking real questions." She didn't respond, not right away. She wanted to understand, but part of her still bristled at the way he had kept her in the dark. "Why didn't you tell me the truth earlier? About the company, your real life?" Nathan exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't trust myself to handle your reaction. I didn't want to lose the only genuine connection I've had in a long time." His words landed with more impact than she expected. They weren't smooth or rehearsed. They felt jagged, like they had cost him something to say. Emily turned her gaze back to the road, her chest tight. Back at the house, they didn't go to their separate corners. Instead, they stayed in the kitchen, a quiet dinner cooking between them. Emily sliced vegetables while Nathan stood at the stove stirring sauce. The air was less charged now, more grounded. It was a rhythm neither of them had shared before, something that felt like tentative partnership. After they ate, they stayed at the table, talking well into the evening. Nathan told her more about Hailtech, how it had started in a dorm room, with a friend who later betrayed him during a corporate buyout, how the success came fast and messy, how fame had exposed him to people who only saw dollar signs. He explained the public pressure, the lawsuits, the media frenzy that followed, when his company was implicated in a government contract scandal, even though his role had been peripheral. "I left to breathe," he said, looking down at the rim of his coffee cup, "to get out before it consumed me." Emily listened, not interrupting. This wasn't a man spinning a sob story. There was no victimhood in his voice, only exhaustion. She realized, sitting across from him, that this wasn't just a man afraid of intimacy. This was someone who had been punished for letting people get close. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why choose me for the arrangement?" Nathan looked, because you didn't look at me like I owed you something. Everyone else always did." She didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, watching the wind bend the trees outside. The night was quiet, but the storm that had brewed between them for so long had finally started to clear. It wasn't perfect. There was still so much unsaid, but a foundation had been laid, however fragile. And then, just as the air began to settle, the outside world knocked on their door. Literally. A loud, insistent knock echoed through the house just past 9 o'clock. Nathan stood instantly, his shoulders tensing as he walked to the door. Emily followed, her instincts prickling. At the door stood a man in his early 40s, well-dressed, with a familiar arrogance in his stance. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Nathan," the man said smoothly. "Long time." Nathan didn't move. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" "I heard you got married," the man replied, his eyes flicking to Emily. "Wanted to offer my congratulations." Emily stepped closer to Nathan, sensing something was wrong. Marcus's smile widened. "No need to be shy. I'm just here to talk, purely friendly." Nathan didn't invite him in. "Say what you came to say." Marcus's tone dropped a notch, losing its pretense of civility. "You're in the public eye again. People are noticing. Questions are being asked. It's only a matter of time before someone starts digging into your arrangement." Emily felt her stomach twist. "I'm not threatening you," Marcus added, his eyes now fixed on her. "I'm just offering a solution. A trade. I keep quiet. You give me something in return." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Get off my property." Marcus didn't flinch. "You always did think you were above consequences. I said get out." With a smirk and a mock salute, Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Nathan closed the door and locked it, his face unreadable. "Who was he?" Emily asked, her voice tight. "A former partner, the one who sold me out years ago." Emily's thoughts spun. "He's going to go public with something, isn't he?" Nathan nodded. "Unless I stop him." For the first time since their wedding day, Emily saw something in Nathan she hadn't seen before. Not reserve, not hesitation, but fear, not for himself, for her. She realized then that whatever Marcus threatened to reveal, it wasn't about Nathan's wealth or status. It was about their marriage, the contract, the lie. Emily's chest ached. She had agreed to the arrangement in desperation, but now it was tied to something much larger, much more fragile. And for the first time, she felt the weight of what that meant, not just for Nathan's reputation, but for the strange, delicate bond they had started to build. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war, and Emily wasn't sure which side she was supposed to be on. The days that followed Marcus's visit stretched into a tense, charged silence. Nathan became more distant, not in the cold or evasive way he had been before, but in the focused, calculating way of someone bracing for impact. He spent hours in his office with the door closed, his voice hushed in phone calls, typing furiously, pacing. Emily, who had once tiptoed around his boundaries, now found herself lingering by the closed door more than once, torn between respect and concern. She didn't need to hear the words to understand the stakes. The quiet urgency in his movements told her everything. Whatever Marcus had threatened, it was real, it was coming. And Nathan was preparing for it. Emily felt the ripple effects without fully knowing their source. Her name, once unknown to the world, now sat on the edge of exposure. She imagined headlines, questions, photographers catching her unaware on the street. The idea of being reduced to a headline, mystery wife and gold digger or worse, made her skin crawl. But what unsettled her more than the threat of public scrutiny was the possibility that their carefully contained world could implode from the inside. One evening, Nathan didn't come home. Emily waited until midnight, her phone silent, her nerves unraveling. At 1 a.m, she called Clara, unsure why. Maybe because she needed a voice that didn't belong to this manufactured life. Maybe because she needed to hear someone say it was going to be all right. Clara answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. "Emily, I'm sorry, I didn't know who else to call." "Is it him?" Emily nodded even though Clara couldn't see. "He didn't come home. Did he say where he was going?" "No, but I think something's happening. Something big. Someone from his past came to the house and now he's different." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emily, you've always had good instincts. Trust them. If something doesn't feel right, protect yourself." Emily hung up a few minutes later, reassured only by Clara's steady presence, not by anything concrete. She didn't sleep. She sat by the living room window until dawn, watching headlights pass and waiting for the one she knew so well. At 6 a.m, Nathan walked through the door. He looked wrecked. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders stiff. Emily rose immediately. "Where were you?" He dropped his keys on the table and sat down without removing his coat. "I was with a lawyer, and a publicist, and a crisis manager." "Marcus isn't bluffing. He has documents, copies of our contract, financial transfers, even the marriage license. He's prepared to leak everything." Emily sat across from him slowly. "What does he want?" "Money, influence, a seat back at the table." "Are you going to give it to him?" Nathan looked at her then, really looked at her. "No, but not because I'm trying to play hero, because if I do, he'll keep coming. People like Marcus don't want compromise, they want control." Emily exhaled, her thoughts spiraling. "Then we need to take control first." Nathan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "I mean we get ahead of it. Tell our story before he can twist it." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "And what story is that? That I paid a woman to be my wife, that I hid everything from her for months?" "That's not the story," she said sharply. "The story is that we made a choice. Two people trying to survive. And maybe it started wrong. But that doesn't mean it has to end that way." He stared at her, something flickering in his eyes, something softer than she had seen in weeks. "You'd do that? Speak publicly? Risk your own privacy to defend me?" "I'm not doing it for you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm doing it because I'm tired of being invisible. I didn't walk into this to be protected. I walked into this because I had nothing. But I've grown since then. I'm not the same woman who stood on your porch with a suitcase and no future." Nathan didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood, walked around the table and sat beside her. "I'll set up the interview," he said. They spent the next 2 days working with Nathan's team, drafting statements, preparing responses, building a timeline that felt honest but not incriminating. The contract would be acknowledged but framed within the context of mutual benefit. 2. Consenting adults navigating hardship, not scandal. Emily felt her nerves unravel with every draft, every practice question, every flashbulb in her mind imagining the chaos to come. On the 3rd day, they taped the interview with a respected journalist known for fairness and tact. The set was sterile but intimate, the lighting soft, the questions cutting but not cruel. Emily wore a navy blouse Clara had given her months ago. Nathan wore his usual restraint like armor. When asked about the arrangement, Emily spoke first. "I was desperate. He offered me stability. I accepted. It was a decision made in a moment of survival." "And now?" the journalist asked gently. Emily glanced at Nathan before answering. "Now it's more complicated, but real." Nathan's answer was shorter. "She saved me from myself." When the interview aired, the response was immediate and polarizing. Social media exploded. Some called it manipulative, others praised their honesty. Reporters camped outside the Hailtech building, speculating about corporate damage. Marcus, true to his nature, tried to double down, leaking additional documents and emails, but the worst had already been neutralized. The public had seen the couple's faces, heard their voices, judged for themselves. Nathan remained cautious, but Emily saw the shift. The weight on his shoulders hadn't lifted entirely, but it had adjusted, shared. A week later, Nathan handed her a folder. Inside were papers to dissolve the contract. She stared at them for a long time before speaking. "So it's over." He shook his head. "Not over, just no more paperwork between us, no more lines drawn in ink." "And what would we have instead?" He hesitated. Then, time, honesty, maybe something real. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the folder, placed it gently on the table and met his gaze. "Then let's see what happens when no one's pretending." Nathan reached for her hand. She let him. Emily hadn't spoken to Daniel Hayes in nearly 10 years. He had been her neighbor back in Rome, Georgia, the boy who gave her her first comic book, the one who taught her how to ride a bike in the empty parking lot behind their church. Time and life had pulled them in opposite directions, but some bonds, no matter how distant, never fully break. She found him again by accident, or perhaps by necessity. In the aftermath of the interview, as speculation buzzed and Nathan's name appeared in headlines across every major media outlet, Emily kept one eye on the news and the other on Nathan. He was handling the fallout with a type of calm she couldn't fully grasp, but even she could see the pressure weighing down on him. Investors were watching. Analysts were whispering. Even allies were keeping their distance, unwilling to publicly endorse someone whose personal life had suddenly become a matter of national interest. Emily knew that Marcus wasn't finished. The man's silence in the days following the interview wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And sure enough, by the end of that week, a new article surfaced on a fringe financial blog, one that detailed not just the terms of her marriage to Nathan, but subtle accusations against his character and ethics as a CEO. The source was unnamed, but the tone, the insinuations, it all screamed Marcus. That's when Emily thought of Daniel. She found his name through a quick search. He was now a journalist for a mid-level investigative publication based in Atlanta, with a growing reputation for clean reporting and fact-based commentary. His recent work focused on tech transparency and corporate ethics. If anyone could help her diffuse Marcus's growing narrative, it was Daniel. She sent him a message. Simple, direct. "Daniel, it's Emily Carter, from Rome. I need your help. It's urgent." He responded within the hour, asking to meet. They met at a quiet cafe on the east side of the city. When she walked in, he stood immediately, taller than she remembered, leaner, his hair shorter, but the same sharp eyes and kind expression. He smiled cautiously, the years between them melting as he pulled out a chair for her. "Emily Carter," he said with a soft laugh. "I thought you'd vanished." "I did," she replied, "and now I need to reappear for the right reason." She explained everything, not every detail, but enough to paint a full picture. The contract, the real marriage that emerged from it, the threats from Marcus, and now the half-truths being seeded into public discourse. Daniel didn't interrupt. He took notes, asked pointed questions, but never pushed. When she finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "This is messy, but it's not hopeless. If I can expose Marcus, connect the dots between him and these leaks, it'll discredit everything he's been trying to do, but I need evidence, proof." Emily nodded. "Nathan might have that, or at least something close." "I'm not doing this for clickbait," Daniel said firmly. "I'm doing this because it matters, but it'll take a few days, maybe more. I'll keep you in the loop." True to his word, Daniel dove in. Emily returned home and told Nathan everything. At first he was skeptical. The idea of trusting a journalist, especially with such volatile information, made his jaw clench. "I've seen what happens when people decide to write their version of the truth," he said. "He won't twist it," Emily replied. "He's not like the others." Nathan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'll give him what I have." Over the next few days, they compiled old emails, timestamps, and flagged conversations. Evidence of Marcus's manipulation, blackmail, and past misconduct. Daniel worked around the clock, cross-referencing data, speaking to sources, tracking IPs linked to the early leaks. His article published 3 days later. It was titled "The Power Play Behind the Curtain: How Greed Tried to Rewrite a Marriage." The piece went viral, not just because of its content, but because it didn't sensationalize. It laid out the facts with precision, exposing Marcus's coordinated attempts to discredit Nathan through planted sources, falsified contracts, and attempts at bribery. It included emails, timestamps, and quotes from former associates who had witnessed Marcus's behavior firsthand. But the most compelling part of the article came near the end, a quote from Emily herself. "This wasn't a fairy tale. We didn't fall into each other's arms. We made a choice. And sometimes when you choose to build something with honesty, even from something flawed, it becomes real." The public reaction shifted, not overnight, but meaningfully. Support poured in, not just for Nathan, but for Emily. Women wrote to her, thanking her for being honest about her vulnerability, about taking a risk. Men, too, commented on her strength, her refusal to be reduced to the role of a passive wife. Nathan's board issued a statement reaffirming their confidence in his leadership. Stocks steadied, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt lighter. Nathan found Emily in the kitchen that night, sitting at the island with a cup of tea, scrolling through comments she didn't expect to read. "How you changed the conversation," he said, leaning against the counter. "No," she replied, "we did." He smiled, barely, but it was there. "I owe you." "You don't," she said, her voice quiet. "Not anymore." Nathan walked closer and stood across from her. "Then I'll say thank you for protecting me when I couldn't see how to do it myself." "I didn't do it for you," she replied. "Not entirely." He looked at her, not speaking. And in that silence, there was something tender, something unspoken, a recognition of all that had changed, all that had been risked, and all that might now be possible. That night, when Emily walked down the hall to her room, she paused. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she turned around and walked into his. New York felt like a different planet. The city's rhythm pulsed beneath Emily's feet from the moment she stepped off the plane. Taxis honked, strangers brushed past without looking, skyscrapers loomed above like silent watchers. It was the kind of place that swallowed the unsure, chewed up the unprepared. And yet Nathan walked through it like he belonged to it, like its energy bowed for him. Emily wasn't sure why he had brought her. Maybe it was strategic, maybe symbolic. But when Nathan was invited to speak at a high-profile technology summit in Manhattan, a gathering of executives, investors, journalists, and industry leaders, it was Emily he asked to accompany him. She had hesitated at first. Their story was still fresh in the media, still raw in public opinion. But Nathan had looked her in the eye and said, "If you're willing, I want you there. Not as my shield, not as my statement, but as my partner." So she had come. They checked into a luxury hotel with sweeping views of the city. The suite was too elegant for comfort. Glass walls, white furniture, rooms that echoed. Nathan was calm, reserved, but she could see the tension behind his posture. This wasn't just a business trip. This was his re-entry into the world he had left behind, the world that had once nearly broken him. The day of the summit arrived with grey skies and cold air. Emily dressed carefully, choosing a deep burgundy dress with clean lines, elegant, understated. Nathan wore a charcoal suit, the same quiet confidence he wore like armor. They didn't speak much on the way there. The city moved too fast for conversation. The event was held at a towering convention center near the river. Inside, everything gleamed: polished marble floors, bright lights, walls adorned with banners of tech giants. As soon as they entered, Nathan was recognized. People nodded, greeted him, some with genuine warmth, others with thinly veiled calculation. Emily stayed close, her presence noted but unchallenged at first. It wasn't until they reached the networking lounge that the first tension surfaced. A woman approached, tall, poised, and undeniably beautiful. She wore power-like perfume and greeted Nathan with the kind of familiarity that made Emily's stomach tighten. "Nathan," she said with a smile too wide, "it's been a long time." He nodded politely. "Genevieve." Genevieve turned to Emily, eyes scanning her with polite appraisal. "And this must be the wife everyone's talking about." Emily extended her hand. "Emily Hale." Genevieve took it, her grip just tight enough to be felt. "Interesting how quickly things change. I remember when you used to say you'd never settle." Emily offered a calm smile. "Life has a way of changing our priorities." Genevieve raised a brow. "Or maybe it changes the cost of being alone." Nathan cut in, his voice cool. "We're here for the summit, not old battles." Genevieve backed off with a smirk, disappearing into the crowd, but the damage was done. Emily's chest tightened. She had expected scrutiny. She hadn't expected veiled insults delivered with champagne in hand. Later, Nathan was called to speak on a panel. Emily sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap as she watched him transform. On stage, he was different, commanding, articulate, effortlessly in control. The questions were sharp, some designed to challenge his credibility, others to provoke. But Nathan answered them all without blinking, until one journalist, a thin man with glasses and an edge to his tone, stood and asked the question they had all been waiting for. "Mr. Hale, how can the public trust your leadership when your private life has been, let's say, unorthodox? A contracted marriage, concealed wealth, a media narrative that paints a picture of manipulation. Shouldn't transparency apply both professionally and personally?" The room tensed. Nathan's expression didn't change. But before he could answer, Emily stood. She didn't plan it. She didn't even realize she had moved until the microphone was in her hand. "If I may," she said. All eyes turned to her. "I think what we forget," Emily began, her voice clear and even, "is that transparency doesn't mean telling everyone everything from the start. Sometimes it means revealing the truth at the right time, in the right way, with the right intention." She looked around the room, heart pounding but steady. "I was desperate when I met Nathan. I was vulnerable. And yes, our marriage began as an agreement. But what grew from it wasn't about contracts or convenience. It was about trust, about learning who we really were when no one else was watching. And if you think that's manipulation, then maybe you've never been in a position where survival required compromise." Silence fell. Nathan looked at her, something deep and unreadable in his expression. Emily stepped back, returning the microphone, then resumed her seat. The panel ended shortly after. Journalists flooded the lobby, questions flying, cameras flashing. But this time the questions were different, less accusatory, more curious. Some were even kind. Back in the car, Nathan didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned to her and said, "You didn't have to do that. I know. You saved me again." She looked at him. "No, I saved myself. I just didn't want to do it without you." His hand reached for hers. For the rest of the ride, they held on. The day after the summit felt different. There was a new rhythm to everything, as though something had been loosened or unlocked between them. Back in Atlanta, the house felt warmer, though nothing had changed physically. The walls remained the same, the furniture untouched, but the air carried a quiet shift. Nathan was lighter, not in words or gestures, but in presence. He lingered in the kitchen longer. He stood by the windows more often, watching the trees sway with a kind of introspection Emily hadn't seen in him before. And at night, he sat beside her without a clock ticking between them. But with this new peace came a subtle tension that neither of them addressed at first. The contract still existed, even if it now sat in a drawer untouched. Their marriage had transformed, but its foundation still bore the echo of a transaction. It hovered over every conversation, every moment, of softness. Neither of them had said the words aloud, the ones Emily now felt perched on the edge of her thoughts more and more often. One evening, Nathan cooked dinner, insisting on doing it himself. He wasn't a chef, but he tried. Pasta with overcooked noodles and a salad that leaned too heavily on vinegar. Emily laughed when she tasted it, not cruelly, but genuinely, and for the first time Nathan laughed too. Not a chuckle, a full, unguarded laugh that made her chest ache because it was real and rare. Afterward, they sat on the couch, the TV playing some muted documentary neither of them was watching. Nathan's hand was close to hers, almost touching but not quite. Emily turned to him. "Do you ever think about what happens after the year ends?" He didn't move. "Yes. And I think I don't want to go back to before." The words hung there, soft and heavy. Emily looked at him. "Then why haven't you said anything?" He shifted slightly. "Because I don't want to make assumptions, because I'm not sure what you want." She breathed in slowly. "I don't know what I want either. Not completely, but I know I don't want this to end with silence." He nodded. "Neither do I." The next morning, she woke to find a folder placed gently on the kitchen table. It was the original contract, now voided, with Nathan's signature over a dissolution clause and a small handwritten note on top. No more rules, no more agreements. Only truth, if you want it. But Emily didn't smile when she saw it. She didn't feel relief. She felt weight. Because the moment she had imagined for so long, the one where she would be free to walk away without guilt or condition, had finally arrived. And instead of running toward it, she felt paralyzed. She needed space, not because she was angry, not because she was afraid, because she needed to make sure that the feelings growing between them were not born out of rescue or obligation. She had to know if what she felt was love, not gratitude. She left without ceremony, packed a small bag, left a note on the counter, and took the train back to Rome, Georgia. The town was smaller than she remembered. Her parents' house hadn't changed. Same paint peeling from the porch, same curtain fluttering in the front window. She stood there for a long time before knocking. Her mother answered, eyes wide. Her expression didn't soften, not immediately. But she stepped aside. Inside, the air was stale and thick with silence. Her father sat in the living room watching an old baseball game. He didn't look at her. Her mother sat at the table. "You look different," she said. "Not kind, not cruel, just factual." "I am," Emily replied. "You married rich?" Emily met her eyes. "I married a man I didn't know. Then I learned who he was, and I stayed." Her mother didn't respond. Her father muttered something unintelligible. Emily stood there, waiting. For anger, for resentment, for anything human. but what she received was indifference. "You came all this way to say that?" her mother asked. "I came to see if I needed anything from you," Emily said. "Turns out I don't." She walked out without another word. Back at the train station, she sat on a bench, holding her phone in both hands. There was only one number in her mind. Nathan hadn't called. He hadn't messaged. She had expected him to. Part of her had hoped he would, but part of her knew why he hadn't. He was giving her the space she needed, even if it cost him everything. She dialed his number anyway. He picked up on the second ring. "I went back to Rome," she said. "I figured. I needed to see them, to see what I left. And? They were exactly the same. I'm not." He didn't speak. "I'm coming home," she said. This time he answered, "Good." When she arrived, he was waiting on the porch. No speeches, no demands, just a look and an understanding. She stepped into his arms without hesitation. And this time, there were no contracts, no barriers, just two people choosing fully, freely, and for the first time, together. Emily had always believed that closure required confrontation. For much of her life, she had chased answers from people incapable of offering them. Parents who saw her as a burden rather than a daughter, strangers who assumed her silence meant weakness, and now a past that had tried to define her through to abandonment. But standing on that porch with Nathan's arms around her, she realized that closure wasn't about hearing what others had to say. It was about knowing what she no longer needed to hear. Returning to Atlanta wasn't a grand event. There was no dramatic reunion or sudden confession of love. Instead, there was something quieter, more profound, a mutual understanding that something fundamental had changed. Emily had left to remember who she was before the chaos, and she had returned not because she needed Nathan, but because she chose him. They moved slowly in the days that followed. There was no rush, no pressure to define what their relationship had become. The contract that once bound them sat in a drawer, untouched, and now irrelevant. Nathan never brought it up again, and neither did she. Instead, they focused on living. Emily found herself observing Nathan differently now. She saw the fatigue he tried to hide, the subtle signs of someone still healing from years of public scrutiny and betrayal. But she also saw the man who woke up early to make coffee for two, who read in silence beside her without needing to fill the space with words, who looked at her not with expectation but with something more genuine, hope. One morning, while sitting on the back porch, Emily turned to him and asked a question that had lingered since the day she came back. "Why didn't you come after me?" Nathan set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Because you left to make a choice. If I followed you, it wouldn't have been your choice anymore." She looked at him for a long time, the breeze teasing strands of hair across her face. "I thought maybe you didn't care." "I cared so much it nearly stopped me," he said, voice low. "But I couldn't ask you to come back if you didn't want to." Emily reached across the table and took his hand. "I came back because I realized something. I thought I was looking for freedom, but what I really wanted was something real. And it turns out that's what we were building, slowly, painfully, but honestly." They sat like that for a while, hand in hand, saying nothing more. Later that week, Nathan took her to the Hailtech offices, not for a press event or a conference, but for a personal reason. He wanted to show her something. As they walked through the sleek corridors, people nodded and smiled, and Emily noticed that their glances had changed. No longer curious or suspicious, but respectful. Nathan led her to a floor she hadn't visited, before to a room filled with engineers, designers, and developers, working together in an open, collaborative space. "This," he said, "is the new division we're launching. Consumer technology focused on privacy and accessibility. It's not public yet, but it will be soon." She looked around, intrigued. "Why show me?" "Because I want you to be part of it," he said. "Not as my wife, not as someone doing me a favor, but because I've watched you adapt, grow, solve problems, connect with people. You see things differently, and this division needs that." Emily blinked. "You want me to work here?" "I want you to help shape it." It was more than a gesture. It was trust, not built on romance or obligation, but on earned respect. Emily didn't say yes immediately. She asked questions, took notes, met with some of the team members, and then after a few days she agreed on her terms. She would join part-time, learning the ropes, contributing where she could, with the freedom to grow at her own pace. The change was slow but steady. Emily found herself waking up with purpose again. Her days filled not just with tasks, but with meaning. She had a role now, one defined by her skills, not her relationship, and every evening she returned home to a space that no longer felt like a stranger's house, but like a life they had created together. Their relationship continued to evolve. They weren't in a rush to define themselves. There was no dramatic proposal, no sweeping declarations, just consistency, just presence. And slowly, love emerged, not as an event, but as a condition of their new life. It revealed itself in gestures, in Nathan remembering her favorite tea, in Emily learning how to reset the router for him when he got frustrated, in their shared glances across the dinner table that no longer needed translation. One night, as they sat watching the fire crackle in the living room, Nathan turned to her. "You know, when this all started, I thought I was saving you." Emily smiled softly. "And I thought I was saving myself. But I think what we really did," he said, "was save each other." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, we found each other, that's different." And it was. Because Emily Carter, once thrown out with nothing but a suitcase, now had a home. Not one built on wealth or convenience, but on trust, growth, and mutual choice. Her life hadn't been rewritten in a fairy tale arc. It had been rebuilt. One day, one decision, one truth at a time. Spring arrived in Atlanta not with grand announcements, but with subtle shifts, longer days, warmer breezes, blossoms pushing their way through the cracks of sidewalks. For Emily, it mirrored the evolution of her own life. The changes hadn't come all at once. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic revelation. Instead, there was quiet persistence, a slow, deliberate building of something real, one moment at a time. It had been nearly a year since she had stood on Nathan Hale's porch with a suitcase in her hand and nowhere else to go. Since then, she had navigated a world she never imagined entering. Wealth, scandal, public exposure, and something far more terrifying, intimacy. Not physical closeness, but the kind that required vulnerability, the kind that demanded truth. Now that chapter was closing, not in finality but in transition. Their marriage, once outlined by a contract, existed now only in the present tense. There were no legal obligations remaining, no false pretenses. Only two people who had stripped themselves of the expectations placed upon them, by the world, by each other and by their former selves. The morning of their anniversary came quietly. Emily woke before Nathan, the room bathed in soft light. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sound of his breathing steady and near. It amazed her how familiar it had become, how comfort had grown from what once was a calculated risk. She rose, dressed simply, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. There was no elaborate plan for the day. They had decided weeks ago that they didn't want to celebrate it with spectacle. It wasn't a date that marked the start of love. It marked the beginning of something uncertain. And yet, it mattered. Because it was the day their lives had changed, even if they hadn't understood it then. Emily made breakfast, pancakes and scrambled eggs, still imperfect, still slightly overcooked. When Nathan entered the kitchen in his usual quiet way, she looked up and smiled. "Happy? What are we calling this? Anniversary? Beginning of the end of the beginning?" Nathan leaned against the counter, smirking. "Let's just call it Tuesday, but a very good one." They ate together without ceremony, their conversation easy. Afterward, Nathan disappeared for a while, returning with a small box. He handed it to her without preamble. Inside was a key. Emily raised an eyebrow. "To what?" "To the place we're building." She looked up. "It's outside the city," he said. "Not too far. Small house. Land around it, we can plant things. You said once you wanted a garden, thought we could start it together." Her chest tightened. She wasn't one for tears, but this moment clung to the edge of one. "I didn't expect anything," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I wanted to give it." They visited the property that afternoon. It was a modest house, nothing extravagant. Wooden shutters, a wraparound porch, an old oak tree standing sentry near the edge of the field. The interior smelled like pine and paint. It was empty, clean, and full of possibility. "This is ours?" she asked. "If you want it to be." Emily walked through each room, imagining color on the walls, mismatched furniture, evenings spent reading by the fireplace. She saw dinners with friends they hadn't made yet, photos not yet taken, laughter not yet shared. And most of all, she saw a future not defined by money or survival, but by mutual creation. "Yes," she said. "I want it." They spent the rest of the afternoon sketching ideas on a notepad Nathan kept in his car, where the bookshelves would go, what kind of light fixtures they'd choose, what vegetables they'd try to grow first. They disagreed on flooring and cabinet handles, but agreed on everything that mattered. That night, back at their current house, Emily sat on the couch, a cup of tea warming her hands. Nathan joined her a moment later, resting beside her in the comfortable silence that now defined their closeness. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," he said, turning to face her. "And I don't want to ruin the calm with something heavy, but I need to know." She met his gaze. "Ask." "When we started this, when it was still just a contract, did you ever think it could become real?" She considered the question, letting it rest in the air for a moment before responding. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't think either of us were capable of something real. Not then. We were both too guarded, too broken. And now I think we've earned it." Nathan reached for her hand. "There's something else," he said. "I want us to start over. Not erase what happened, but redefine it. Not because we have to, but because I want to." She understood immediately. He wasn't proposing a renewal of vows. He was asking for a beginning, one that wasn't born out of necessity or secrecy, one that was chosen. "Yes," she said, "but on one condition. Name it. We do it at the new house, just us. Maybe Clara, and Daniel if he brings his camera." Nathan smiled. "Deal." In the weeks that followed, they continued their quiet work, moving boxes, painting walls, setting up shelves. Emily kept her part-time position at Hale Tech, growing steadily into her role, trusted by the team and valued for her insight. Nathan continued to lead without flash, his decisions now less guarded, more collaborative. The world had stopped watching so closely, which suited them both. Their love didn't become a fairy tale. It became something far better, lived in, honest, evolving. They still fought, still disagreed, still had days where silence returned. But it was a different silence now. One that didn't stem from fear or distance, but from comfort. From knowing that no matter how quiet the room became, neither of them would leave. Emily often thought about the girl who had stood on Clara's porch with nowhere to go. She wished she could reach back through time and tell her something important.